Hey everyone, Ariel Adams here with the Superlative Podcast. My guest today is Jason Heaton. He is a podcaster, a watch writer, a content producer, and overall a representative of a big part of the watch-loving demographic. Jason, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Ariel. This is really fun to be on here. We kind of cooked this up on our trip to California that we had dinner and you said, hey, you want to come on the podcast? And I was like, yeah, let's do it.
It was really only a matter of time. You know, we've both been at so many events together over the years and in our own respects have done a lot of podcasting. I think that it's important to bring as many voices together as possible. It's funny, people don't always know, but this is it's a strange industry where not everyone is friends all the time. People tend to silo themselves, and I've always noticed at how kind of silly that is.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I've tried to do, not just with this show, but especially with this show, is reach out to anyone, anywhere. It doesn't matter if they may be in a competitive space. It doesn't matter if they have different ideas than me. I have tried to create, especially for future generations, some record of what I think is sort of a weird golden era in watchmaking, because I think in the future when people look back at the products, they'll be just as confused then as we are when we look at the 50s and be like, what were they thinking when they made that?
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. And I do agree with you about how we tend to get siloed. And I mean, even though you and I have crossed paths over many years at different events and things, trade shows and press events and things, you know, we've never really had a chance to sit down and have a good conversation. So I'm looking forward to this. I've always respected your sort of, how should I say, different take on things, kind of a neutrality, I guess. You know, I think you've kind of stayed the course and I think I respect you for that. So that's really great. Yeah,
I remember I got a compliment a while ago from a brand. This was actually not that recently, but their compliment to me after me doing this for many years is like, Ariel, you're so authentic and you haven't changed. And I had to think about that for a while. Like they meant it as a sincere compliment.
Sure,
I was like,
yeah.
Is the presumption that I'd be fake and turn into a weirdo? Has that happened with others? Because this industry can change people if they don't continue to monitor themselves, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think my take on it is I came to watches from a gear background. I was writing for Gear Patrol and kind of doing outdoor stuff, like bikes and skis and that sort of thing. And so watches, I didn't come to it as a like kind of luxury watch collector. And it was a kind of an eye opener to see some of the personalities in this business and how I feel like luxury has a way of sort of tainting people to a certain degree. There's a certain sense of, for lack of a better word, entitlement when it comes to a lot of the kind of personalities in our industry, and I'm not going to name names or throw stones or anything like that. But I've always just sort of observed from a distance and kind of chuckled about it.
Yeah, the psychology is interesting. I think what's important to note is two sort of contradictory things about watches. They attract people who are very into themselves. I don't mean that in a bad way, but they're thinking about their own identity a lot. They like to celebrate their identity. And they're also aspirational a lot of the time, meaning they always think about having a better identity. And so what that means is you wear the watches to celebrate who you are, but oftentimes, if you see maybe someone you think is doing better than you, you then are like, oh, I want to be like them. And rather than really go their journey or do something to be accomplished, you just copy how they look like, how they dress, or the watches that they wear. And we see so much of this behavior, which is a sort of form of social mimicry where it's like, oh, I like what that guy's all about. Rather than try to actually have those accolades, I will copy what he or she looks like and what their hobbies are.
Yeah. That's an interesting viewpoint. I think you're spot on there. And we're kind of jumping right into the deep end here. That's great.
Well, I mean, we can't comment on this industry exclusively by talking about the product. That would be inane and boring and we'd hate it. The culture, I think for you and I in our own respective ways, is just as interesting as the physical items, right?
Yeah. I was just at this event out at Topper Jewelers up in the Bay Area, and I was doing a little talk about dive watches. That's kind of my niche, I guess. And one of the comments I made was, like, I think somebody raised their hand and said, I'm not a diver, but I have a dive watch. How do you feel about people that have a dive watch that don't dive? And I said, look, I don't care if you don't dive. Diving's not for everybody. But
you're supposed to have a feeling.
what bothers me is people that feel like, they shouldn't do stuff with their watches, or they really need to kind of protect these. I get that these are investments and that these are luxury products, but I just feel like, to a certain degree, like just it in the end, it really isn't about the watch. It's what you do while you're wearing it. That's kind of my viewpoint on it. So rather than try to be somebody else, as you mentioned, be yourself and make the watch part of you, part of your personality.
Well, I'll explain a little bit about, for people that don't know you, what your appeal is. And I'm speaking about you as sort of from the side. You actually have an interesting relationship with a lot of the people that make watches because you yourself do a lot of the activities that some of these watches are meant to do. Just because of your own interest growing up where you did, you're an outdoorsy person. We'll talk about diving a lot. You created a lifestyle for yourself where you go places and do things that a lot of these watches are meant to do. And I feel that the people in Switzerland are fascinated by that because they live such sort of manicured lives. They're like, oh, you actually adventure? Will you take our watch and tell us if it falls apart, if it helps you? They sort of, and they do this with, some of these explorers that they hire as ambassadors. I think these people are fascinating because unlike you that has a job out of it, they just get people to pay them to go on long treks or do stunts. And I'm like, wow, the watch industry is single-handedly funding professional daredevils, and I don't even think they know it.
Yeah.
But the industry's fascinated by the people that do the things that their watches are meant to be accompanied on, right?
Yeah, that's true. And fortunate for me. I mean, I've kind of, turned it into a bit of a career. I mean, I just kind of exploring, kind of going really, pardon the pun, deep on the dive watch stuff, as you mentioned, based on my own interests and kind of finding where the watches fit into that. And you're right. I think, sometimes when a watch brand has, back in the day when I was doing more kind of reviews for Revolution or for Hodinkee or whoever, I would approach the brand. I'd say, can you send me one of your watches? I've got a dive trip coming up and I'd love to take it and review it. And they're like, whoa, and it's sort of this bit of anxiety that you hear in their voice and, a lot of forms to be signed and this sort of thing. What will you be doing with it? And be careful of this. And I said, it's not a guarantee it's going to come back perfect, but it's kind of what you guys designed it for. And these are well-made products. And I like to say the more you pay for something, the more you should expect of it. And, these are precision, highly durable, well-made, lifelong instruments that you should be able to rely on. So
let's back up for a moment and talk about sort of both of our career trajectories because there's some similarities. And I think the similarities are we found an activity we liked and we tried to say, how do I build a career around that? There's a sort of, we have to manifest that. Also, there's an accidental nature to it. But talk a little bit about this idea that you got into a career where you could do the things you love and essentially profit from your hobby because it doesn't happen. You can't really plan it. It kind of happens accidentally. Talk about where you were in life and sort of how you got into, and I mean this in a loving way because I'm the same way, but a professional hobbyist.
Yeah, true. So I got an English lit degree in college, and what do you do with an English lit degree? You either teach or whatever, teach, and Instead, I went a different direction and I started doing technical writing. So I was writing manuals, technical manuals for packaging machinery. And then I got into the medical space and was working for a pacemaker company doing regulatory affairs, documentation and stuff like that. And meanwhile, on the side, this was, mid-noughts, I guess, 2005, 6, whatever. And I got into the watch forums after I bought a watch. And then I started reading different websites, Gear Patrol being one of them, and they were looking for someone to just do freelance stuff on the side, reviewing gear. And I signed on to do that and just did a few reviews here and there. And then it was about the same time that because that watch that I bought, which happened to be an Omega Planet Ocean, I was like, I kind of need to learn how to dive if I'm going to wear this watch. It bothered me, I need to know how this thing works. So I got into diving. And then that led to this merged sort of focus of diving and watches. And then because I was writing for Gear Patrol, it sort of blossomed. It happened very organically to the point where after a number of years of as you're well aware of how things, especially back then, were going, there were a lot of press trips. There were a lot of invitations to go here and there and visit the manufacturer and, go sailing here and diving there and whatever. And it just became like, there was a tipping point where I was able to do enough of that I could jettison the day job. And I made that leap and haven't really looked back since. And then it's just followed its own course. And I like to say that a watch changed my life and not in the way that, you might think, but it's just, it's kind of set me on this trajectory of learning to dive and then making that a career. So
thanks for giving some of that background. I didn't know all of that. It makes sense, the technical writing background. I actually have some parallels there. I didn't professionally do any technical writing, but with my legal career and things like that, you basically have to do technical writing. So I actually approach writing. I first learned how to technically write before I learned how to do anything else. I was like a terrible English student. So it's interesting how that combination of desire to talk plus having some technical background, because you have to have not just technical understanding, but the ability to communicate technical ideas in words if you're ever going to be a watch reviewer, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That said, I think I've always had this romantic notion of, and I've written a couple of novels that some people might have read, but I've always fancied myself more of a creative writer than a technical guy, because a lot of technical writers come from an engineering background, and I didn't. So I always felt like I was.
Aspires to be a technical writer?
I always felt like I was faking it a little bit doing technical manuals because I didn't have an engineering background, but I really wanted to be a creative writer. I really liked guys like Sebastian Junger, John Krakauer, Ernest Hemingway, Ian Fleming, kind of this sort of thing where you're really writing about adventure and stuff like that. And so my watch reviews have, I again, sometimes I go to watch events or the big shows, Basel World in the past or Watches and Wonders, and I feel like I'm a bit of an imposter, because a guy like you or many of our cohorts in the industry, like most of them know a lot more about movement finishing or complications or things like that. It's never been my focus or my particular interest. I'm always about, like, my reviews or my articles were always like thinly disguised, watch reviews that really are like travel reports or, adventure stories, which is what I like to do. So I'm more about the use of the watches than the watches themselves. I'm kind of embarrassingly undereducated when it comes to stuff about
that's
movements.
That's okay. None of us know everything about watches. I think that's the beauty of having multiple voices on it, is that just the vectors of appreciating a watch, the different ways you can sort of be into watches are so vast. Like you said, you can be into it because you want to wear a cool tool. You can be in it because you love like really rare history things. You can be in it for technical purposes. You can be it just because you like bling. Like there's I call them vectors for appreciation. There's multiple ones. And that's, I think, what's so amazing and dynamic about the field. But again, you are part of a long line of people that I think is crucial to really creating the lifestyle. And, before the generation of you and I, and this is sort of gone now, when there was more magazines, what they actually would do, and this is, again, going back probably to the sort of 70s and 80s and 90s, is they would find someone like you that just did those things anyways and say, "Sir, madam, you live this lifestyle. You own boats and do this stuff. Could you just be like the yacht columnist?" And there was a lot of this. There was someone that was literally just either a well-to-do person that could afford the stuff, like the planes or the watches or the booze, and they would be asked by a publication as being an authentic member of the community to write about that stuff. But that all went away with those publications, and then it became not just less comfortable, but there's oftentimes like little or no money in it. And I remember speaking to some of these, I hate to call them old timers, but at this point they sort of are. And I remember when things started changing, like, these press trips are so uncomfortable. Can you believe how they treat you? They didn't do that for you. They flew you there how? And there was this whole generation of folks that, it was it was definitely cushy for them, but it all existed because there was these relatively well-funded magazines. And all that media sort of went away to large part, where rather than having publications that have their staff, there's just a bunch of individual freelancers. We're sort of like gunslingers doing our best in kind of a crazy Wild West world, right?
Yeah, that's true. And I think that era of the cushy press trips, we were in that golden age for a while there. And I think, after a while, I started to realize that, I'd be invited on a press trip, wherever it might be, Iceland with Lange, strange combination, but I went to Iceland with Lange and Zona. And, you end up going with largely the same folks from a pool of 10 or 15 watch writers at the time. And you'd all be, having the exact same experience, standing side by side, aiming your camera at the exact same thing, wearing the same watch. And then inevitably, if it was an online publication, a week later, there'd be the story, everybody kind of writing a slightly different version of what happened. If it was a magazine, it would be a month later or whatever. And I kind of grew tired of that. I wanted to have more unique experiences with a watch. So I got to the point where I was trying with not a lot of success to like convince publications to, rather than send me on a press trip, like let's put together, if there's a budget, like let's put together a unique trip that I do. And my wife was, who was doing most of the photography, even the underwater stuff. We would say like, we'll, okay, it sounds like a bit of a game that I was playing here, but like we'll go to the Caribbean and do a week-long dive trip, and let's take 3 watches with us.
It's okay
and
if it's a win-win.
Yeah. And believe me, it was work. I mean, it wasn't vacation. It was, as you probably know, I mean, it is work to get the shot. And when you're going diving and you're in a beautiful place, but you're so focused on like posing and holding your wrist in a certain way and getting that shot with the right light and the right backdrop, like
a perfect underwater wrist shot is a huge pain in the ass. I don't care what equipment you have. It's a lot of trial and error and frustration.
Yeah. I mean, tiny, shiny object, in this vast environment, underwater that hates gear and that sort of stuff. Yeah. So it was a challenge, but that was kind of my goal. And I had some success with that for a few years. But admittedly, a lot of that stuff is expensive to pull off. A lot of publications don't have those big budgets to do that sort of stuff.
And the brands themselves were always kind of unsure about how to spend. It's like they had the money, but you could tell they very much did not know how to personally be involved in it. What they should have been doing is been like, sir, you want to do this for us? Here's 10 watches. How much money do you need? Go and be a content machine. It's like, that would actually bring them more value than you. Though just to convince them to be open-minded oftentimes is a really uphill battle, isn't it?
Yeah, that's so true. And I guess the most success I had, the one trip that was kind of perfect was I was working with Revolution magazine at the time. And somehow they had a connection with the tourism board of Mauritius. And so I had talked to, I believe it was Doxa, send me a watch. And then Mauritius Tourism Board wanted a little snippet about Mauritius and the resort we were staying at. So it kind of worked well for kind of a tourism / watch review, and that all came together. But to put that sort of package together over and over again.
There was an era where that was easy. I've also been the uncommon recipient of a tourism board's, interest in getting some promotion. And that did exist, and it probably will exist again. I think what happened, and let's be honest, is that word got out, and while there's a small number of honestly competent, honest professionals like us, there's probably more unscrupulous folks out there who are looking to take advantage. So it's like, we know that when we pitch a brand something, we think that it's going to be good for them from the outset. But what we don't always realize is how much their pitch. I mean, I'm sure you've asked brands. I've asked them all the time. On a daily basis, even the lowest budget brand is pitched with so many types of, we'll just call them media and content offers from every direction. They have absolutely no idea what to make of it all. It's actually turned them into like a turtle just in its shell. They're like, stop with the offers. We don't know what to do anymore. Because they want to work with people that like them, but they lack the evaluation skills to know who isn't good. And it's like the only way they evaluate us is like, oh, Jason, you've been at a bunch of these events. Okay, I guess you're okay. Like, that's the bar. Like, have you showed up for long enough? Yeah,
exactly. Right. I was actually surprised I got on the invite list for Watches and Wonders, because I have kind of not really written for any of the big publication, watch publications for 5 years or so. I hadn't been to Geneva for 4 or 5 years. And so when I got on the invite list this year, I was pleasantly surprised. It was fun to go. And saw you there and a lot of other folks I hadn't seen in a number of years. But I'm just kind of on the periphery of that scene these days. And I think the direction I took was, I was always freelance, so I was writing for a number of publications, but I was talking with a friend, a guy from Gear Patrol, high up at Gear Patrol, one of the co-founders actually, and I remember I had this conversation, it was during the pandemic, and we were just chatting on the phone about something, and he said, I think the future of media consumption is headed in the direction of subscription-based stuff. And he mentioned Substack, and I had never heard of Substack. So immediately after we hung up, I was like, oh, I opened up a Substack, and I started one, and now I'm into it for 4 years or whatever, and I've got a nice little subscriber base, not huge, but
okay.
So
Eric recommended Substack.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Okay.
Or not specifically Substack. He mentioned Substack, but it was that sort of subscriber-based media. And I hadn't really explored that much. And so when I started it, I kind of liked the idea that me as a writer, it feels like a very fair proposition. It's like, if you like my writing, you will pay me for it. I will write, and hopefully you'll like what I write, and we'll just kind of keep going in that relationship, writer and reader. Because one thing that we had done with the Greynado, with the podcast, was we had partnered with another platform on kind of sharing ad revenue for about a year. And we just didn't like doing ad reads. I just don't like advertising. I don't want to do it myself. And Substack isn't an advertising thing. It's a subscriber-based thing. And now the Greynado is also subscriber-based. And I just kind of like that model personally, because I'm not comfortable doing ad reads or chasing invoices, at the end of every month and that sort of stuff. So it's kind of worked well.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing that people who haven't been in the space don't really understand. And I guess the basic is the old way of making money as a content producer is for the most part dead for most professionals, right? There's going to be like a magazine that's going to be like, here's a salary, have fun.
Yeah.
So when you are desirous to be a content producer, you're faced with this interesting sort of set of variables. One is there's a bunch of different places to publish your content, right? You can do video, audio, writing, and there's a whole universe of places to publish. So choosing where to publish is a huge issue. And then having what we'll call a business model. How do you plan on making money from this? Again, there's no right or wrong. I've always thought that consumers are probably the best place to pay for things, but I also disagree that most people want to be a subscriber. I think that I'm waiting for technology to get to the point where we can do microtransactions. I really feel that if someone searches on Google and wants to know information about a watch they're interested in, they'll pay 25 cents to read a pretty good review. I don't know if they want to commit to $10 a month to read one article.
Yeah.
I think that is ultimately what's going to be the fact. But there's a lot of technological hurdles to that. You can't even make those small transactions without it costing. A 25-cent transaction will cost you 40 cents to make if you use a credit card processor, right, for example.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of issues like that. But someone in my or Jason's position has to look at this strange world of options and decide what to do. And you have to sort of go all in. Like if you go the subscriber model, you have to sort of give it a few years. You have to understand the strategy, a little trial and error. And you basically become the host of this community. You are sort of a vicarious friend of theirs. You have to deliver them an interesting conversation and stuff. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So in a sense, you can't actually do both. I started on the advertising-driven model for a lot of reasons, but mainly because at the time when I started in 2007, there was no culture online of buying content. It was either ad-supported or free. Yeah. And I've always believed in the viability of what I call the magazine model. Probably like yourself, I grew up reading all types of enthusiast magazines. And I love the fact that this is the editorial and this is the ad. I know the difference. Yeah. And I want to know about these items. It's my hobby. I'm curious about the companies that are in it, right? Yeah. So for me, that's always been a very legitimate model. And outside of the desire to spend, I think it actually works really well for brands. But you're right, there's this emerging area of paying for content, which every platform is in on, whether it's, a Patreon model or it's in, actually YouTube where you can subscribe, you can tip people. There's a lot of experimentation. I just wonder how far you can push the consumer before they're like, you know what, you've nickel and dime me to death. I don't want to pay for anything anymore. Like we may be coming to that point. Yeah,
I agree. And I think it's one thing I don't say wary of, but I'm cognizant of is subscription fatigue. Everything's subscriber now. I mean, you click on an article from someone sends you, read this cool story from The Atlantic, or check out this, there's a great series on Hulu, or what. I mean, everything is subscription based. And at some point, people get fatigued with that, and then they start to make evaluations. And I guess that is also what's rewarding. The flip side is that's what's rewarding about people that actually stay subscribing to what I write. It means that they truly do value it enough to keep that in their roster. Yeah. But there will be an end, or there will be a change of the guard at some point again. One thing I've noticed about aBlogtoWatch is that you do ads, but you haven't gone the commerce line, correct? Am I right? I mean, you've never pursued that, or have you experimented with that? Well, like selling watches. Let's just call it what it is. We have absolutely made a firm statement that we're not interested in selling watches for a lot of reasons. The main reason, or the main two reasons, is one, I don't feel you can have a credible voice about the product if you're also trying to sell it.
I don't see, I just see it as a huge conflict of interest. I don't see any reconciling the fact. And the second is that that's an entirely different business that takes a different culture. I want to be in the media business. I don't want to be in the watch sales business. I'm not a good salesperson. Again, as a trained lawyer, I took an oath to try to give someone good advice. As a salesperson, you're kind of trying to screw them as much as possible while still smiling, right? Like that's how you make a profit. And that's just not what I want to do. So I didn't think that it was good for our audience. Yeah. And I have a lot of respect for people that do that. And I always saw this industry as an ecosystem. And I know a lot of people don't, but I feel that it all needs to work together. You have people that make watches. You have people that sell watches. You have people that communicate about watches. You have people that service watches. Those all have to be their independent entities, and they interact because it's an ecosystem. But brands who try to do it all oftentimes bite off more than they can chew. Stores that try to do it all often bite off, more than they can chew. And you see that. And I've, I think, correctly predicted where a lot of these business models would go. And you notice very few of them actually end up having a sustainable business. They just keep jumping from investor to investor. Here's $10 million to try to figure it out for a few years. Okay, we lost that. Next person. Oh, yeah, we're really onto something. Okay, here's another $10 million to try for a few years. They're just jumping from investor to investor. None of them have stumbled onto something that really, really works. And I'm very cognizant of that.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think the bottom line is that selling watches is a crucial thing here, but I want to get people excited about the hobby. My goal, I always used to think this way, is if I could turn one person every single day into a watch enthusiast, that would be satisfying, right? I don't care what they buy, but if I can reach one person and sort of like unlock the watch lover inside of them, that would be good. And so I advocate for the hobby. I try to speak to the type of consumer that resonates with me, which is a slightly different person that resonates with you, which is a slightly different person that resonates with one of our other colleagues. Because again, there's a lot of different demographics out there. There's not just one pool of people that buy watches. That's what's so amazing about it. And I just hope that there's enough, honestly, intelligence and wisdom on the brand side to know about how the demand creation engine works, right? Because I see it that way. It's an engine that creates demand for their products. Alone, throughout all of history, they've been terrible about it. I mean, think of the days of like Breguet and Jacques Drouot. They had to actually travel thousands of miles in like the 18th century to like Asia and be like, you got to buy these things. Like, other than showing up at their doorstep, there was nothing else they could do. That's the best they've ever figured out. They need people like us. And so I try to advocate for them to understand what we do and deal with us at an arm's length distance, as opposed to constantly co-opting us to do their whims. And I think that's the dangers of media, is that if you listen to what the brands want you to do, you will quickly find yourself in obsolescence.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, the arm's length analogy is good. I mean, I think that's kind of where I like to be. And I think it's in this industry, it's seductive, right? I mean, you get pulled in with a lot of very nice offers and the very nice people in the business, and sometimes it's difficult to say, no, this doesn't feel right to me, or this isn't quite the right fit. And
you've carved out a niche as a respected content creator, and so what I think that you've done interesting, and it's politically good for you, is you're not really about opinion. You're about, let me take your products and film them, shoot them in my world, because you need that type of content. And if there's anything brands need a lot of, it's content. And when they trust you to take their watches out into the world, and they also trust the end result, that's a very fortunate position to be in, right?
Yeah, that's true. And I've never, I've always been very upfront about the stuff that I do in terms of full disclosure. If it's a paid trip or something, you say it is. But I also don't have really any qualms about, in my current stage in my career, I don't have a problem working directly for brands, and I've certainly done that. Like, for instance, when we met in California, I had been on an expedition with Oceana, and it was kind of underfunded by Blancpain, and I've done a fair bit with Blancpain over the past couple of years. Just I felt very fortunate because it's a brand that I like. They're very into diving, and And I was in French Polynesia helping them with the launch event for the Tech Gombessa. And then in Cannes, I moderated a panel last fall for the 70th anniversary of the 50 Fathoms. And like, I enjoy doing stuff like that. It's not what I ever set out to do. I mean, as I mentioned with my background, I'm a writer first, a slightly more reluctant podcaster second. And when it comes to like getting FaceTime or being, in a video or live sort of presenting, it's like that is at the very outer edge of my comfort zone. But I'm kind of like getting more comfortable with it. I kind of like doing that. It's fun. It's different. It's a new challenge. Yet it still remains in my wheelhouse. I still focus on diving. I'm never going to like show up for Blancpain and talk about a perpetual calendar mechanism or gem setting or something like that. It's
rewarding because you get to call some creative shots. They are, asking you to do something, but ultimately you get to decide how you do it. And that can be rewarding, right? Because you can help, enhance their universe. I agree. It's an interesting thing. We've done a lot of projects for brands for many, many years. I've done everything from write commercials to do a lot of this, stuff that you do.
Yeah.
And, there is a real sense of you being able to add something to it. If I was in an agency, for example, I would have a lot less creative freedom. Somebody else will be telling me what I need to do. But when brands ask you to do something for them, there's a lot of trust that goes with it. And chances are they'll use what you make. And it can be a very nice thing to do, provided they give you the resources and let you do what you want to do. It can be, like I said, a very rewarding thing. And you can recognize that once you're sort of in that circle of trust, you're like, oh my God, they need me or people like me. Like they absolutely do. Because left to their own devices, these brands will basically make the same thing for as long as possible and communicate it about as little as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, true. And, look, I'm not going to take any credit for this, but I have seen, even since I started kind of doing the weird niche dive stuff that I've done in the mid 2000s to now, there are a lot more people doing it, which is great. We got folks like Derek Hager and Ben Lowry, and just there's people diving with watches and taking pictures and stuff, and it's great. I mean, the more the merrier. Jump in the pool, so to speak. So it's fun. So I've kind of, for a while there, I sort of occupied that space by myself, and now I don't want to even talk about these people as competition because I think there's plenty of space for everybody, but I've kind of tried to forge or find different avenues and things to talk about.
In a sense they are. I mean, I think that's very important to talk about this just given the class of professional that we are. And that is certain things we do, if they become popular, it'll be copied. And not just by other, freelancers in the space. Oftentimes the brands themselves are like, oh, that worked really great. Let's just do it ourselves. So to remain relevant, you need to, as you said so astutely, keep finding slightly different things to do that are not as saturated. But also, and I think this is crucial, find that thing that you basically do better than anyone else or do more efficiently than anyone else. I think I've accidentally found some of those things. You probably have as well. But because at the end of the day, you only know what you're good at by virtue of what other people don't copy. And I'll give you an example on my end. I thought a long time ago, people would fundamentally come out with better watch reviews than what I would write, okay? And they haven't. I, for whatever reason, seem to own the watch review article space. People make longer ones on YouTube or more produced, but no one seems to approach just reviewing a watch better than me. And I've noticed that just by virtue of the fact that the other ones out there are so fundamentally different. And, even the consumer says it's very fluffy. It's just saying nice things. Where's the criticism, whatever. But And with my team as well, like if we see type of content out there that's being replicated a lot, I'll be like, guys, let's stop it. I mean, podcasting is an interesting example because the barrier to starting a podcast is low. Really, anyone out there can start a podcast, but to continue to do it, to have a conversation that people are interested in, that is that's not easy, and that's not for all personality types. Yeah. And you and I think, have proven ourselves. We're doing this for many years. I mean, I don't know if you know, I did basically the first watch podcast in 2010 with John Biggs. There was nothing before then. We did that for a few years, and I took a pause and then came back. And then, James James, when he was working for me, I think that's when he started the Grey NATO. At the time. And I was proud of him. And I love to see that you guys would keep at it, because that's the hard part, is that consistency, right?
Yeah, that's so true. And we see a lot of people that say, I'm starting a podcast, and then they do 5 episodes, and then maybe they don't get the traction they hoped for, and then it falls off to 1 a month. And then, it's the same with blogs as well. I mean, back in the day, it's like then pretty soon it goes away. And then you look and it's like, boy, I haven't heard from these guys in a while. And you look and it's like last episode was, 2021 or something. It's like, okay, I get it. It's
a lot of that.
It is difficult. Consistency. It's like stay the course and just keep your nose to the grindstone and just keep doing it. So yeah, that's important.
Writing, a lot of people in this space who come from the passion from writing background harbor this idea of, what I'd love to do one day is just pause everything and write books.
Yeah.
You've done a couple of novels. Very proud of you for that. At some point, I hope my kids are older and I have more time to do those things.
Yeah.
But talk a little bit about the internal desire to write, and then, and this is, I think, the important question, deciding what it is you're going to write about, because there's just so many directions you can take. And I think it'd be interesting to hear your particular strategy and how you decide what to write about.
Yeah. So, I think, in terms of kind of when I made that decision, I had actually started, my first novel was called Depth Charge, and I had actually written the first chapter, I think it was about 10 years ago. I don't think, I think when it comes to writing fiction, when it's the right time in your life, you have to mature into it. I don't think I was ready to write fiction or a novel, especially a novel, in my 20s or 30s. And so there was just a point at which I felt like I wanted to tackle that type of a challenge. And the catalyst was my wife and I were on vacation. Of all places, we were at Ian Fleming's home, his property down in Jamaica, Goldeneye.
Cool.
And it just seemed like a fitting place. And we were sitting there, and I remember I got sort of a piece of, I don't want to call it bad news, but a business proposition that fell through that wasn't going to happen. And I immediately flipped a switch in my brain. I was like, all right, if that's not going to work, this is the time. I'm going to sit down and write a novel. And I remember kind of going about it methodically, kind of mapping out the plot, the chapters, the characters. I had some plot ideas kind of loosely based on some news items, which is a great place to source that. But I always knew that I wanted to write, having come from an English lit background, you're so focused on reading the classics, the Brontes, Hemingway, Chekhov, etc. And it's like, I kind of I was tired of that. I was tired of reading, having to writing stuff or reading stuff that had to be analyzed in a very serious intellectual way. I just wanted to write fun thrillers. And that's what I did. And given my interest and background in diving, I thought, what better thing? An underwater adventure, a couple of thriller books that take place with a diver, kind of a protagonist, like a Dirk Pitt or a James Bond, but in a much more contemporary, less macho sort of sense.
Yeah, those are not very contemporary books.
No, they're not. They're not.
But
I wanted that genre, that kind of page turner. And I remember studying up on what makes a good thriller. And it's get to the end of the chapter, make the person who's reading it, if it's late at night and they get to the end of the chapter and they say, I'm going to sleep after this chapter, they don't go to sleep because they want to flip the page and see what happens, And that was kind of my guiding, compass.
It's hard. As someone who has done an insane amount of writing behind a keyboard, putting together a story, thinking about something that's more long form, it's hard. I've done a couple of watch books. I haven't read anything that you would call a novel yet.
Yeah.
And I was very intimidated at the beginning. I was like, oh my God, I barely have the patience. I've undiagnosed ADD or something. The idea of writing something that takes months, blew my mind. I had to medicate myself to study for the bar exam because I had never studied for any exam before. And I was like, well, you're not going to pass if you don't study. I don't have the personality type for that. So when I approached these book projects, I knowing my own weaknesses, and knowing that I wasn't going to go out there and get an Adderall prescription to do it, but when I was done, I was like, whoa, I could do this. This is hard, but I can do this. And then it gets you excited. And then you reach this point and realize there's a lot to do. And what you can contribute, I think, is a hard thing. You like fiction and that type of storytelling. I like fiction, but I think I like to critique designs because I know that I am not a designer myself. I know where my limitations are.
Yeah.
I would probably get into some type of more nonfiction writing, but the bottom line is that it's a hard thing to do. Do you feature watches in your books? Do you throw them in there, or is these books nothing to do with watches?
They're not a central part of the plot, sort of. I guess there was a watch in Depth Charge that was kind of central, and it was a nod to my background, my watch nerd, fan base, if you will, people that knew me for that kind of writing. And the other thing I liked was I I like novels that, and Ian Fleming was very good at this, like that go into a lot of specific detail about things. I think it lends a certain authenticity. So whether it's the tires on the car someone's driving, or the brand of champagne he's drinking, or something like that, and
it makes
and
the
it's
world real. When it's like set dressing. They just set dress with a lot of detail.
Yeah, and a lot of authors don't do that, and I really wanted to do that. And I it always bothers me when I read a novel and there's some error in the description of something. They're talking about diving and they say, "Oh, his oxygen tank ran out." It's like, you don't take oxygen underwater. You're breathing air. It's the same thing with watches. Like, I really wanted to kind of dig in and kind of pick just the right watch for the hero.
Yeah.
And it was something inherited from his father, and it had to be this dive watch from the 60s that would have been kind of a insider's dive watch. So it wasn't just going to be a Rolex Submariner. It was like, so I did put some thought into that. But I will say that the key technique that I used, you talk about, the patience to sit and write something. It takes months. And for me, the light bulb moment was when I realized that if I broke my book down into chapters, and I had an outline of where the plot was going, each chapter I could make roughly the length of, and you'll know this well, like a feature story for a publication. Or let's say it's a longer watch review or some op-ed piece or something. Let's say it's 2,500 words or 3,000 words. Like, if I could make each chapter that length, and then you string together 20 chapters, you've got a book. And so I would break it down that way, and I knew how long it would take me to write 3,000 words. It's like a day's work, and then you'd edit it later, of course. But so that's kind of how I broke down the work. And I thought, if I can just make each day like writing a story, like an article, and then just string a bunch together, that made it easier for me.
Yeah, I mean, you have to break it down in these chunks, and that's part of the thing that I think is interesting is when you read a book, kind of like when you visit a house, it seems overwhelming. You're like, oh my God, how did this come together? But it really just comes down to a bunch of discrete steps. And if you do them all correctly, the final result feels amazingly cohesive. But it requires a bunch of very specific steps that, a lot of planning. I mean, maybe some people are going to sit there and start writing. I don't know that works out very well, aside from masters like a Stephen King. Yeah,
that's so true. Yeah, it would be, and admittedly, with the first book, I kind of thought I could get away with that. Sit down and just start writing first sentence and just keep going. And then I painted myself into corners with characters, and they would, wait, I can't kill them off yet. I got to back out of that and rewrite this and get rid of that character and introduce something else later. And so the second book was much more methodical. I had the, stereotypical sort of big whiteboard with timelines and that sort of stuff on it.
So I want you to try something in a future book and see what happens. Basically, so the idea is to add watches that if you actually knew what they were, it would be a little bit absurd, but it sounds good in the text. And I'll tell you where this came from. Years ago, I had the privilege of interviewing Bret Easton Ellis. The writer of cool stuff like American Psycho. And I remember I don't know how we got to this topic exactly, but I was bringing up in American Psycho how I loved all the detail. Like, he would go into excruciating length to talk about everything from the food people are eating, especially the clothing. Yeah. And he told me that actually these are all real clothing, and if you saw what he was putting together, everybody would look like a clown. So it sounded really good, but he was actually making a mockery of it. He had fashion mag. He was living in Manhattan at the time. He was looking at all these fashion magazines, because remember, they all had the name of the designer on it, right?
Yeah.
And he would just make these, he called them clown outfits. And I thought that was so hilarious that no one but him would actually know this, because there's no one on earth who would actually put all these things together visually. Yeah. But you could have all these characters wearing what sound like cool things, but if you actually put it on there, you'd be like, that's silly. Nobody would wear that.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So you got to do some of that just for me.
Yeah. I'll keep that in mind. Yeah. I kind of took the route of okay, what would a true, egomaniacal villain wear? And it was, it had to be and this guy was a former naval officer who'd been corrupted, and he was, into bad things. And anyway, I thought,
so what was it? What was the watch?
It was a big Breitling. I didn't, and in some cases I got into a lot of detail about specific watches, but in his case, I just kind of left it vague. And same thing with the villain in my first book. It was a big Rolex, and I never said what kind, but I was in my mind, I was picturing like a two-tone sea dweller or some big, deep sea or something like that. Just like a big showy kind of macho watch, and a Breitling was just perfect.
I bet the villain's watch is probably funner to think about than the hero's watch.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, and then I had another guy who was wearing a Casio, like it was kind of a cheap Casio. It just seemed fitting for him. So yeah.
Going back to books, do you think there's a missed opportunity in the watch industry to help tell more actual stories? Because what I find is, even though there's no deficit of books, for lack of a better term, that they like to publish, they very rarely say anything. I remember I was chatting with, on the show, we had Bill Prince, who was the writer of the 50th anniversary of the Royal Oak book for Audemars Piguet.
Okay.
And Bill's a good guy and obviously the big topic. But the actual book has almost nothing in it. And that's not his fault. Like, he wanted to tell an actual story, but the brand was like, yeah, we don't really want anything actually said. We want a bunch of like filler text, a lot of and mostly pictures.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a real missed opportunity to tell in narrative novel form stories about this industry that are not just like brand feel-good stories. Do you agree?
Mm-hmm. Do you mean about the industry itself or about specific genres of watches or specific brands?
That's the thing. It's everything from the true history of the adventures that this watch went on to some of the personalities behind the industry. I mean, there's a lot of fun stories in the industry that are not told in any written way. Yeah.
And I think, you touched on this a little earlier. Brands, especially Swiss brands, they're very protective of their brand image and their storytelling and everything. And so I think there's a bit of a fear of exposing anything that might possibly be negative. Like it could be, and look, I mean, no disrespect to a brand that I like, which is Bulova, but like that mill ships or mil-spec dive watch that they came out with, which I actually quite love. The one that it's kind of a recreation of a watch they made in the 50s. Yeah, that's a cool watch. And I was just diving in Monterey 2 days ago, and my buddy Kevin was diving with me. He was wearing one, and it's a really cool watch. But like,
nice
if you look at the history of that watch, when it was developed for the Navy, and they tested it, it failed pretty badly. And was ultimately rejected in favor of a Tornik Rayville, among others. And I think that element of the story was forgotten, and yet I still love the design of it, and it's still an interesting history. And Bulova has nothing to hide about. I mean, it's a cool brand. They've got a long history of making great watches, including dive watches later on. But like brands are so careful to not include anything that might smack of negativity or failure along the way, or misses or whatever, that I think it prevents those sort of real stories from being told. Like, let's just air all the laundry, dirty and clean.
Do you think that they have more to gain by telling those stories than to lose by telling them?
I think, we talked about authenticity earlier, and I think authenticity is something that people can smell. They can ferret that out. They can tell when they're being fed a story versus being given the unvarnished truth. And I think people would appreciate that, because in the end they would like, watch brands are not unlike people or heroes in a book. Like when I'm talking about the hero in my novels, it's like I wanted a flawed character because I think people can relate to them more. And I think with a watch brand, you don't necessarily want some ivory tower brand that's done everything right along the way. You want to see some misses and some weird designs. And, you look at some of those weird quartz Hoyers and Speedmasters from the 70s, like that's a Speedmaster? Like, what is that? Or Navitimers or whatever. And it's like, but that was part of their history. And let's show those proudly,
I think what's important to say is it's not just about funding. Yeah, it'd be great if the brands paid for these things, because obviously, production requires resources, but it's access. And that's really the problem. Even if you had your own funding and a publisher and you wanted to go to one of these brands and say like, hey, I really want to write the history of this, they'd be like, no. Even if there's like only stuff for them to game, their like reflexive response is no. And I mean, I'll give you an example. I'm curious about the Hayek family, the Swatch Group Hayek family, especially, the late Hayek Sr., who was an incredible character. He influenced so many people. And I've had this idea of writing a book about him, but by interviewing his family, right? And I mean, I don't know if they've actually seen the pitch. I've definitely pitched it to others in the group. But I think the amount of fear that could come from that, because like my request would be like, let me hang out with you people for 2 weeks and interview you. I think it would be a really interesting story, their family's take on it, But I mean, I think just knowing what you know about the Swatch Group, there'd be like 100 no's to 1 yes on that request, right?
Yeah, true. Yeah. But think about it. Like there's this sort of trend these days with streaming media, like Netflix, for instance. They do these shows, what's it called? Drive to Survive, the Formula One thing, or the tennis. There's a tennis version. There's a, I think there's a pro golfing version.
Did you see the
whatever.
tennis one that Rolex widely promoted? I never thought that I would turn on Amazon Prime and see a Rolex logo.
The Federer one. Yeah. But to my point though, like the cameras were going behind the scenes in the Formula One, for instance. I watched the first season, and it's like you're seeing the good and the bad and the ugly of guys getting angry at each other and storming off the set, or disputes on the team and whatever. That makes it more compelling to me. I don't just want to see the glossy success stories, and I think the same with watch brands. And look, a luxury product doesn't have necessarily the same human element, but there are a lot of human stories in the history of watchmaking. We talk about World War II is a big, it's a big one. Like some of the brands were making watches for the bad guys, and like that's often glossed over. It's like let's dig that out. Let's talk about that a little bit.
I mean, I think the reality is the community is more interested in it than the current people that run the brands. And there's a real mentality there. And I think this is crucial and sort of foreign for a lot of Americans because we're just too new. But at most watch brands in Europe, you work at a company that you yourself didn't start. And you're basically told you are sort of ushering it for the next generation. You are protecting whatever the identity is. You're not meant to add to it. You're not meant to detract from it. You're preserving it almost as you would an old house, right?
Yeah.
Maintain it, upkeep it, but don't change it. That's not for you to do. And they give a huge amount of credibility to people in the past that made creative decisions, yet they feel no independent agency to be able to do it themselves. Even when you look at the story, you and I know that a lot of those creatives in the past, they weren't given a special permission. They just made random decisions. Yeah. And today they're terrified of doing the same thing. Yeah,
that's true. I think that's what makes kind of the rise of the micro brands compelling for a lot of us too. It's like you get enthusiast-based brands that are doing exactly what they want to do and responding to things that we watch enthusiasts want to see. So it's like, I would really love a whatever watch without a date, or with a bezel that turns both ways, or a purple dial or whatever. And like, lo and behold, there's a guy out there who will make that happen.
Fill in that gap.
Yeah, for $800 or whatever it is, and that's cool. It's fun.
Important question, because we're talking about taking dive watches underwater, and dive watches are obviously, at the very least, meant to keep water out of the case. You probably have more experience than most media people actually testing dive watches underwater. Have you had failures? Have there been watches that like, broken, water inside, can't read it? Talk about some of those things.
Yeah. I've had...
You don't have to mention the brand, but I want to hear about the experience.
I'm happy to. I mean, it's fine. And again, unvarnished truth, right? I mean, it's trial and error. Some things fail. Look at, I'm a big Land Rover fan, and Land Rover does not have a great reliability reputation. So, but with watches, I've kind of done a rough count. I've taken over 200 different watches underwater over the years, and I think out of that number, I can count on one hand the number that have leaked. I had one that it wasn't even for a review. It was a watch I owned. It was a 1,000-meter aqua timer, the Twin Crown IWC from back in the early 2000s, probably. I had just gone for a shore dive up in Lake Superior, very cold water. I was using one of the crowns to adjust the bezel, and not terribly deep. And I think that might have what caused the water intrusion. And I came back up and it was fogged. So that was one. That was my own watch. I was working on a photo campaign for, again, I don't want to throw brands under the bus here, but in this case, it was a prototype when Shinola came out with their Monster line of dive watches, Lake Monsters, I think they called them. Yeah. They sent 3 or 4 different colorways that they had. And I was down on a dive, and I could literally see the dial just filling up like an aquarium, and just like filling up with water. And it was very clear. I got back on the boat, and it was I unscrewed the crown, and it was like you couldn't see a gasket. I mean, this was like a prototype, like it should have said for photo only or something on the back, but it didn't. And they sent it to me with the knowledge that I was diving with it. So that was obviously a failure. And then I had a fairly well hate to say it, well-publicized one. I had written a review. Should I say the name, I guess? JLC, it was a Polaris, and I took that diving and had an issue with the crown seizing up and actually falling off from corrosion. And that one, I liked the watch. It just, something went wrong with it. It just failed, and that kind of turned into a bit of a storm in a teacup, that one. But,
what happened exactly?
There were two, I think this was the 2-crown version, and I had adjusted the crown on it to rotate the internal bezel, and it just came unthreaded and just came off in my hand. And I realized that the stem had just gotten water in it to the point where the salt water had just kind of corroded the mechanism. And so the watch itself did not have water inside of it, but it was enough to kind of seize the mechanism for the internal bezel, and then the crown actually came off.
That's crazy. I mean, it's good when it's not your watch, but it's sort of it's a shock because remember, these are supposed to be, in theory, life-saving tools underwater. And you know, if you didn't have your dive computer with you, and that was your only, be like, I don't know how to ascend anymore. I don't know my stop times. I don't know how long I've been diving. You know, like it's a pretty serious thing. But it's great to hear that most of them did well. I mean, I think that's actually a success.
I mean, 5 out of 200, that's not a bad, what is that? That's, 2.5% failure rate. That's not so bad when you think about it. So I'll take that. And things happen, you know, wheels fall off and cars fail as well, and phones
I've never
else.
had a watch fail while diving. I haven't been diving as many times as you, but I have had things where I just take in the swimming pool, right? And just that has been enough to screw it up. And some of them have been prototypes, even though I said that I would do that, just like you did. I don't blindly take things in water. And some of them have been my own watches, and some of them have just been, commercial ones. And some of them have been like seriously deep divers, like 1,000-meter diver. And it's like funny, like I've had watches that like are not really meant for more than just swimming, do great. And then just like super durable, goes to the bottom of the ocean, and like, but you can't handle being in my pool.
Right. I think though, again, going back to telling the whole story, if some didn't fail, we wouldn't be as awed by the ones that do well. I mean, it is quite. I never tire of being on a dive or even a shallow snorkel or swimming or whatever, and looking at your watch underwater. I think that's one of the primal satisfying experiences that any watch enthusiast has. It's that distortion of the dial. It's just looking at it underwater. And I think to see what's been done since, whatever, the waterproof watch, the 20th century, early 20th century, or mid-century, so to speak. Like the fact that these brands have come up with this amazing protection for this precision mechanism is still it's still a pretty neat and satisfying thing.
It's like the signature, for lack of a better term, invention of the 20th century for wristwatches was the environmental resistant watch. Water was a huge part of it, but magnetism, dust, whatever.
Oh yeah, so true. So true, right?
That is like that's what we really celebrate that entire century for.
Yeah.
And to this day, I'll call this tool fetishists, we get excited about an opportunity to use the tool. I mean, like, I know, you're into cars. What do you really want to do? Drive it off-road or drive it fast? You like weapons. You want to use it. You like knives. You want to cut something, right? With watches, you're like, I don't want to just know what time it is. I want to time something, or I want to go into a dangerous environment. Like, you're so excited about doing the thing that tool was meant for, because in a sense, our lives are, if we're lucky, too safe.
Yeah, you're right. That's actually a good point. We don't just want to tell the time. We want to time something. I love that. Yeah. And to time a dive, or time your cup of tea, or your pizza in the oven, or whatever it is. Yeah.
I mean, I've tried to extol to people who are kind of confused as to how to collect. And I say to them, think of each of your watches as being like a costume, like a kid would wear. And when you put that on, you become that hero, that professional. Yeah. Even if it's just a little bit, it sort of adds to your personality that day. Because I think you'll notice, if you have a pilot's watch on, or a dive watch on, or a dress watch on, and you glance at your wrist, you'll think a little bit differently about yourself throughout that day. And that psychological element is sort of the same as we'd feel with a toy, but in a more mature adult way of doing so. And I like to tell people to use their watches for that purpose, as opposed to getting what they think is the right watch or the impressive watch. Get the one that enhances your mood.
Yeah, man, that's so important. And I think I'm glad you brought that up, because I think people in our positions, especially after years of doing it, like it's easy to get cynical and kind of focus on, like the industry's taking the wrong approach. That watch is too expensive. It's too thick. It's too, this brand needs to do this, or get rid of the 430 date position. It's like you get so nitpicky about stuff. And in the end, I always tell people, like when people say, what watch should I buy? I'm like, which one makes you smile when you look at your wrist? It's 90% aesthetic. Like, you can buy into the brand or the mechanism or the craftsmanship, but like in the end, it's an aesthetic thing. And like, watches should be fun. And you're collecting if you're going to collect.
You know what I say? It's a bit machismo, I guess. But I say it's like a woman. Get the prettiest one that'll stand being around you and that you can afford to date.
Sure. I mean, I think like it's. And I get these questions like, what out of these two watches, which one should I get? And I'm like, I cannot tell you that. Like, it all comes down to your budget, your personal taste, whatever. And I'm happy that you respect my opinion enough to ask me, but I'm not the one that's got to wear it every day and like look at my bank account and think, why did I spend $5,000 on that watch? Well,
we're almost out of time, but I guess we'll end on this topic when it comes to advice. It's a double-edged sword, right? Because you're absolutely correct that the best watch is the one that you, the buyer, chooses for themselves. But they come to us for advice on how to narrow down their options. So like, our utility in their life is to narrow their focus, as opposed to basically tell them like, it's your hobby, you make the most of it, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're their vicarious hobby buddy. And so we have to ride that fine line between helping them to narrow their options, but ultimately not going so far as to be like, that one.
Yeah. Yep. That's a good point. And I don't want to dismiss people by simply saying, you make the call, because you're right. I've tried these watches. I have specific tastes, and to a certain degree, they respect my opinion from what they've read. I've written or listened to the podcast or whatever. And so, but in the end, I try to gently say, look, or I'll ask them, like, what are you going to use it for? What else do you have? And do you like bright colors, or do you like big watches, or whatever, and kind of help them narrow down, but then make the choice themselves. I've
actually found that more often than not, the question is different than what they actually ask. And what they're actually looking for is for them to hear what not to buy. They are perfectly capable of choosing them, but they're afraid of making the wrong decision. As you said, they can be expensive. Maybe they've never worn it before. Maybe the person that likes it, that they read, has different tastes in them. They want us to help them avoid mistakes, because, as you know, buying an expensive watch you don't like can be a painful mistake. It's fixable, but it can be a painful mistake. And so I try to think of it that way. I try to help people identify, well, let's think about what you don't want. And then that will help you narrow down what you do. Because sometimes you see 5 watches in front of you could buy. The reason you choose one over another is that there's just a good deal. They're all of them are great, but there's some little thing that edges it out. And that's sometimes what it comes down to. And you and I can never predict what type of deal they're going to get. So we just help them narrow their little list. And that itself is hard to do, because the layperson coming into this, thanks to us, sees a freaking world of options. And unlike us, has literally no idea where to start. And I'm sensitive to that. And I realize that it is our guide to, or is our we have to be guides, we have to be curators, right? We have to curate.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, I don't want to forget the enthusiasm that I had when I was early into this hobby. And I certainly made my share of mistakes and flipped some watches that I regret selling, and then buying some that I regret buying. And so I guess if you can help mitigate those for people before they do it, that can be a good thing.
I'll end on saying that after all the watches I've seen, I go back to what we'll call tool watches. In my desk, that's what you see. There's some weird watches here and there, but the sort of unpolished, matte, very legible, meant to be durable, that's what my heart gravitates to. And that's what I find a lot. There are some people that maybe have a lot of money and gravitate towards more artistic, decorative things. But if you're sort of like more of a regular person, I think what you'll actually find you like after all is said and done are those tool watches. And so even if you're not necessarily into the adventure stuff, these are the watches that you'll probably gravitate to. And even after all the many, many watches you have seen, we go to that. So I think that there's a lot inherently to celebrate about the tool watch.
Yeah, I agree. It's what I'm all about, and it's where I've made my career largely over the years. And I'm a pretty simple guy. I'm a blunt instrument, and I like blunt instruments.
Jason, we're out of time. Please plug anything. Tell people where they can find more about you on the internet. Mention any of your books you want them to look at. This is your chance. Just let everyone know where they can find more about you. Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you're interested in fiction and you want to read my books, they're for sale on Amazon if you'd like to buy from there. If you want signed copies, jasonheatonauthor.com. I'm selling and shipping signed copies from here. Instagram at Jason Heaton, easy to remember, and I usually put links to stuff that I'm working on. The podcast that I'm co-hosting with James Stacey is called The Graynado. You can go to thegraynado.com. And if you want to subscribe or even just get in for free on my Substack, it's called Swimproof. So SWIMPRUF, named after the hang tags of the old Rolexes from the mid-century, swimproof.substack.com. So thanks for letting me plug those, Ariel. That's great. This has been the Superlative Podcast with Jason Heaton. Jason, thank you so much. Thank you.